Respected chairpersons, senior members of the faculty, and friends. At the outset, let me thank the organizers of this meeting, as well as Dr. P.P. Mohanan, the National President of CSI, for giving me an opportunity to discuss this very important topic, management of acute venous thromboembolism. As you are aware, deep vein thrombosis and pulmonary embolism is a continuous spectrum. A clot formed in one of the veins of the limbs may remain there asymptomatic, may cause pain and swelling of that limb and even lead to ischemia of that limb. Sometimes it may migrate from there, as you can see on the slide, and go to the pulmonary circulation and produce the disastrous complication of pulmonary embolism. So this is a continuous spectrum. I will start from the upper end, or the most dreaded complication, pulmonary embolism. Whenever we suspect pulmonary embolism, say the patient has come with tachypnea, dyspnea, unexplained cough, hemoptysis, BP fall, or shock stage, we have to have a pre-test probability of the happening of pulmonary embolism. Why this is important? Because no diagnostic test is perfectly accurate in the field of venous thromboembolism. There can be true positives, true negatives, false positives, false negatives. Actually, a pretest probability plus the diagnostic test accuracy gives you a good post-test probability of VT. There are various algorithms for calculating the pretest probability, difficult to remember by the clinicians. So the European Society of Cardiology has revised and simplified the Geneva score. I'll quickly take you through that. Age more than 65 years gets 1 point. Previous deep vein thrombosis or pulmonary embolism, active cancer, surgery for fracture within 1 month, unilateral lower limb pain, pain on the lower limb on deep venous palpation and unilateral edema, hemoptysis, heart rate between 75 to 94, all of them get 1 point each, while heart rate more than 95 gets 2 points. So if you have a score of 0 to 1, you have a low probability of pulmonary embolism. On the other hand, if you have a score of 2 to 4, the probability is intermediate. And if the score is 5 or more, it is a very high probability. Now let us look at a diagnostic algorithm of pulmonary embolism without hemodynamic instability. First of all, as already said, you assess the clinical probability either by your clinical judgment or by a scoring system like the one shown. If the person has a low or intermediate probability, you do a D-dimer. If it is negative, you rule out pulmonary embolism, and if it is positive, you send the patient for a CT pulmonary angiogram, which may show pulmonary embolism, may not show pulmonary embolism. If the person has a high probability of having pulmonary embolism, you skip the D-dimer, go directly to CTPA, which rules in or rules out a pulmonary embolism. On the other hand, if the person is hemodynamically unstable, you don't have time for all this. You get a bedside echocardiogram, see whether there is RV dysfunction. Yes, if you can get a CTPA done, do it. If not, treat it as a high-risk pulmonary embolism. If there is no RV dysfunction on bedside echo, search for other causes of shock or instability. And how are we going to manage a case of pulmonary embolism? Well, anticoagulation should be done for all patients. It's a must. Then you see whether the patient is hemodynamically unstable. Yes, if your answer is yes, that is a high-risk situation. That patient requires reperfusion treatment along with hemodynamic support. On the other hand, if the patient is hemodynamically stable, you have to categorize them into a low risk or a high risk pulmonary embolism. If it is an intermediate risk group, we can do a troponin test, and if it is positive, consider RV dysfunction. These patients require monitoring and consider rescue reperfusion if there is deterioration. If troponin is negative, they require hospitalization. On the other hand, if there is no RV dysfunction or nothing on the CTPA, it's a low risk group. And if the person doesn't require hospitalization for any other reason, he can have an early discharge and home treatment. So what are the various modalities of treatment available for pulmonary embolism? One is anticoagulation. It's a must for all patients. Thrombolysis is there. Surgical or catheter-based intervention can be done. Supportive measures in the form of fluids, pressor agents, or ECMO, as well as IVC filters, along with graduated compression of legs, are the various forms of treatment. Anticoagulation can be done with low molecular weight heparin or fondaparinol, which is preferred over unfractionated heparin. If we are using oral anticoagulants, NOACs are preferred over vitamin K antagonists. I need not discuss the dose of unfractionated heparin. You can give a bolus 80 followed by an infusion of 18 units per kilogram per hour, which roughly converts to 5,000 unit bolus followed by 1,000 units hourly infusion to keep the APTT 1.5 to 2 times the control. If it's a low molecular weight heparin, you can use 1 milligram per kilogram BD of enoxaparin or 1.5 milligram per kilogram once daily of enoxaparin. If we are using vitamin K antagonists as the oral anticoagulants, you have to start them immediately along with heparin or low molecular weight heparin. Titrate up the dose to make the INR 2 to 3, and heparin or low molecular weight heparin has to be continued for at least 5 days. If you are using NOACs, there is no need for heparin bridging. Only thing, you have to calculate the creatinine clearance. Thrombolysis is required if there is hemodynamic instability. Streptokinase can be given 2.5 lakh bolus followed by 1 lakh hourly infusion for 24 hours. Next is the role of IVC filters. Well, the European Society says it can be considered in patients with acute pulmonary embolism who have absolute contraindication to anticoagulation, or they have recurrent pulmonary embolism despite therapeutic anticoagulation. So far, I have been discussing in general about the management of pulmonary embolism, which may not be very useful to each and every one of you, because once a patient develops pulmonary embolism, the management is taken over by the team of cardiologists, intensivists, gynecologists, and all. So let us have a discussion on a case scenario, a case of DVT in pregnancy, to exemplify the factors I have already mentioned. A 32-year-old lady, first pregnancy with 28 weeks gestational age, with no significant past history and using only prenatal vitamin tablets, has now come with swollen and painful left thigh for 48 hours without any chest pain or dyspnea. Which investigation will you do? Just keep in your mind, which investigation will you do? One can do a proximal compression ultrasound over the left lower extremity, which was done in this lady, which showed no evidence of DVT in the popliteal, femoral, common femoral, or external iliac veins. What next? You know that there is a possibility of deep vein thrombosis here. Which one will you choose here? Let us take D-dimer. D-dimer has limited utility in the following patient groups, especially in a patient who is pregnant, hospitalized, or post-surgical, so not of much use to us. What about ventilation lung scan? Whatever be the investigation involving radiation, there is a risk of radiation to the fetus, there is a risk of radiation to the mother. The various doses exposed are given in the table here. So it is better avoided. So the next choice is do a serial ultrasound. Repeat the ultrasound after a few days, because one ultrasound alone has got limited sensitivity for pelvic or iliac DVT, which is the most common site in pregnancy. It has been shown that single ultrasound may miss up to 24% of DVTs, and repeating the ultrasound within 5 to 7 days lowers the rate of missing. What about MR venogram, which was one of the choices given there? It detects pelvic DVT better than an ultrasound, not associated with fetal harm. Only problem is the availability issue. So in this patient, a serial compression ultrasound of the lower extremity was chosen, and after 5 days it was done, which showed thrombus in the left common femoral vein. She was ambulatory, she had some pain, but well controlled with acetaminophen. And if you look at her vital parameters and oxygen saturation, they were normal. The left leg was warm with normal pulses and normal sensation. The next question that comes here is, does this patient require admission? Not necessarily. OP treatment is appropriate in a low risk patient. But if the patient has any high risk features as shown here, abnormal vital signs, severe analgesic needs, extensive venous thromboembolism, advanced gestational age, comorbidities, contraindications to low molecular weight heparin, or lack of home support, it's better to admit them. So this patient requires anticoagulant therapy. Again, I am giving you 4 choices. Which one will you use? Direct oral anticoagulants are out. They are not to be used in pregnancy. Subcutaneous unfractionated heparin can be used, or low molecular weight heparin can be used. The recommendation is to use low molecular weight heparin once or twice daily without anti-10A monitoring. Both low molecular weight heparin as well as unfractionated heparin are safe in pregnancy. Fonda is not preferred. Vitamin K antagonists again are not preferred. How do you dose the low molecular weight heparin? Should you give twice daily? The compliance will be less. It's difficult for the patient to take 2 times a day or once daily. Both the regimes have been tried and there is not much of difference between these 2 regimes. There is no need for routine monitoring of factor 10A levels in pregnancy. Is there any role for catheter-directed thrombolysis into the leg? Only if there is a limb-threatening ischemia, it has to be done. So let us continue with the case. She was given anticoagulation with low molecular weight heparin, and in 2 weeks, her leg swelling and pain improved. Low molecular weight heparin was continued. Now she is 35 weeks of gestational age and prefers a vaginal delivery with epidural anesthesia. That is a problem now. Whenever you are going to insert an epidural catheter, low molecular weight heparin has to be stopped. So it's better to have a scheduled induction if you are planning an epidural anesthesia. Stop the low molecular weight heparin 24 hours prior to the anesthesia. Restart at least 6 hours later or once hemostasis is attained, and continue 6 weeks postpartum. So now there is the question of continuing anticoagulation during breastfeeding. We can either use low molecular weight heparin, unfractionated heparin, or vitamin K antagonist. Any one of them can be used, preferably a low molecular weight heparin. She may also ask you about the question of next pregnancy. Do I require an antepartum prophylaxis and postpartum prophylaxis? Well, the answer is yes. The risk of recurrent venous thromboembolism is high in the next pregnancy. Without prophylaxis, it is around 4.2%, and with prophylaxis, only 0.9%. So you have to advise the patient that she will require prophylaxis in the next pregnancy. That finishes that case, and let us have a look at some other aspects. What about prophylactic anticoagulation in a patient who is not having venous thromboembolism? A pregnant woman with no personal history of venous thromboembolism. Still, if there is a strong family history of venous thromboembolism or underlying thrombophilia or underlying coagulation problems, it is better to give prophylaxis. Half dose of low molecular weight heparin can be used than the standard treatment. So if a patient has evidence of thromboembolism, you have to use the full dose. As prophylactic, you use half dose. If the person is opting for a normal vaginal delivery, there is no problem. You can allow normal vaginal delivery on half dose of low molecular weight heparin. But here also, if you are planning epidural anesthesia, it's better to stop 24 hours prior to that. Sometimes we find varicose veins with superficial vein thrombosis, no deep vein thrombosis. Still, it is recommended that anticoagulation be given to prevent this from extending into the deep veins. What about gynec surgeries for malignancy? There comes the issue of DVT prophylaxis. Both pharmacologic and mechanical prophylaxis have been advised. Low molecular weight heparin is preferred, and it is better to give up to 4 weeks after surgery. Well, even though my topic doesn't touch upon this, I thought it is essential to include this, the role of hormonal contraceptives and DVT. Combined hormonal contraceptives, whether they are given as pills, patches, or vaginal rings, always increase the risk of venous thromboembolism. While progestin-only contraceptives, whether they are given as pills or IUDs or subcutaneous implants, do not increase the risk of venous thromboembolism. So over the last 12 to 13 minutes, I have been dwelling on the deep vein thrombosis and pulmonary embolism, the salient aspects, as well as the aspects related to a case of pregnancy. Well, let us say thanks to this man who brought out the 3 factors involved in DVT: endothelial injury, altered blood flow, and hypercoagulability, the famous Virchow's triad. And thank you all for the patient listening. Thank you.